Hi! This video is the Kurt Cobain book list, reading list, and the book today is Shadowland by William Arnold, as seen here on the back of the book. And it's about 1930s Hollywood actress Frances Farmer. Hey, I'm just interrupting this video because this is my second attempt at re-editing this video after it was done. I found out some more really weird things, and I'm just trying to find the proper place in the video to put them. I originally had set out for this to just be a review of Shadowland, which, for all its faults, I do recommend. But then it turned into a comparison between Frances and Kurt because there's just way too many parallels and similarities and strange coincidences. And then I just fell down this little rabbit hole, which we'll be getting back to towards the end of the video. I'll jump back in with this really weird story having to do with Frances Farmer, William Arnold, the author of the book, and Kurt Cobain. So I'll see you again towards the end with that. Now, back to the video. There's a table of contents in the description with timestamps if you want to just hear about a certain topic in this video. When I started reading the books on the list and thinking about doing video reviews for them, I didn't think I'd have much to say about Kurt and would just focus on each book, but this book was completely unexpected and really blew me away with the level of coincidences and parallels between Frances and Kurt, so I can't really avoid it. It's actually kind of spooky, really, the number of parallels between the two of them. So I'm going to be quoting not only from Shadowland, but also Heavier Than Heaven by Charles R. Cross. Yeah, Charles R. Cross. And various magazine articles. If you watched the introductory video where I gave the list of books Kurt enjoyed, you'll know from that video that he wrote, Frances Farmer will have her revenge on Seattle about her. And he recommended this particular book several times in different interviews. You'll also remember that the book I read from with one of the interviews in it had the editor interject and say that this book had been debunked. And at the time I did not understand how you could debunk a biography. It didn't make any sense to me. So I read the book and then I looked into that. So if you open this book up, it says biography right in here, and generally biography is nonfiction. They made this video called Frances in the early 1980s with Jessica Lange, and it's a really good movie. I'd seen it a long time ago, but the thing is, I did not realize that that movie used this book as its basis. But the movie company did not pay William Arnold, and William Arnold sued the movie company because he said that there were scenes in this book that he dramatized and fictionalized himself. Because a biography would belong to anyone. You'd have no claim on a biography. On a fictional work, the author would have a claim. So there are portions of this book that are purely fiction, unfortunately. And if you want to know more about that, if you read this book and then you want to know more about that, or you just want to know more about that, there is a website. It is called Frances Farmer, Shedding the Light on Shadowland by Jeffrey Kaufman. And it's a really long read, and it lists pretty much everything that's wrong with this book. The biggest thing wrong with this book, I'll tell you, is that it claims that Frances had a lobotomy, which was given to her by Dr. Freeman, and I'm going to come back to that name towards the end of the video, because there's a coincidence. But there is absolutely no proof that Frances had a lobotomy. The doctor that it's claimed gave her one never said he gave her one. She never claims that she had one. There's no records of her having one. And if you see her, she went on to have a kind of a small career, a little tiny comeback when she got out of the hospital. And she was on this show in the late 1950s called This Is Your Life. And they would have celebrities come on the show, and there'd be someone talking off in the back with memories, and they'd have to guess who it was from their past. And the interesting thing is that Frances Farmer was the only person in the history of that show who knew who all her surprise guests were ahead of time, because they were really afraid she would have a nervous breakdown right on stage. But the thing is with that show, you can clearly see all the emotions going across her face. There's this one point where she is struggling so hard. You know there's things she wants to say, but she knows that she shouldn't say them, so she's holding back, and she just looks like she's having like an internal war. She's a really strong person. But the thing is, but people with lobotomies are supposed to have very flat emotions. Well, I mean, I don't know anyone that's had a lobotomy, but that's what I've read. She definitely had all her emotions. So how does that parallel to Kurt? It's books like these is my first kind of a parallel. Books that are presented as a biography, but actually contain fictionalizations, dramatizations of things the authors couldn't possibly know, and there's no actual proof that it happened that particular way. So I basically only read parts of this book, the back portion, really. I tried several times to start this book, and I just could not get into it, and I didn't know what it was. But after reading this and reading about the fictionalization of it, I realized that's exactly, I think, the problem that I was having with this book. So, for example, at the end of the book, when he comes back from rehab, the author goes into great detail about him coming home after rehab and pulling out a legal pad and sitting in his room to write his note. The only problem with that is nobody knows how that all happened. Nobody knows where he wrote that note. And that note was not written on a legal pad. It was written on the back of an IHOP placemat. So it's very unlikely he wrote that in his bedroom. You fictionalize a key moment in a person's life in a biography about them and don't mention the fact that it is a fictionalization, it kind of makes it hard to take the rest of the book seriously, or any of the books seriously. It's not fair to the person the book was about, because they're a real human that was just living their life. And they deserve to have their story told accurately. And it's not fair to the reader who is just led along to believe something is truth that's not truth. And for me, that's one of the things this video is about, truth and perception. So another parallel between the two, since we're on the topic of biographies, is the autobiographies that came after their deaths. Frances was in the middle of writing her autobiography when she died, and at the time she was living with her best friend. So when she died, her best friend took over and finished writing the book. Her friend not only took over writing the book, her friend also dedicated the book to herself when she was done. So no one's sure exactly what is actual events and what the friend dramatized or completely made up just to sell books. I do really want to read that book, though, because I'd like to hear Frances's own words about her life. And similarly, after Kurt's death, there was the movie Montage of Heck, which is like an autobiographical movie using his recordings and drawings and journals, and that was put together by his wife Courtney. The only problem with that is a lot of people that actually know him say that there's things in that movie that aren't true and are misrepresented. So there's a lot of controversy. So there's a lot of controversy over Frances's autobiography and Kurt's. Both Kurt and Frances had to deal with the press's invasion of their privacy and the manipulation of their image. And for people who have a very strong personality and defined sense of themselves, as well as a need for privacy, this was a really bad situation to end up in. Both knew what it was to have their words twisted, spun, and edited. And Frances was no stranger to controversy with the press. When she was just 16 years old, she won an essay contest in a magazine with an essay that was titled God Dies. So this was the early 1930s when she won this contest, and as you can imagine, it was really shocking at the time for a young girl to write an essay with that title. And she was written about very negatively in newspapers of the time. And then, just 4 years after that, when she was in college, she won another contest, if you can believe that. She's just winning contests all the time. This time, it was for selling the most magazine subscriptions to a communist-leaning newspaper. And the prize for that was a trip to Russia. So when word got out about that in the newspapers, a lot of people actually tried to stop her trip to Russia. But she was determined to go because at this time in college she had been involved in theater and she was really into stage acting. And Russia was world renowned for their theater, so she wanted to really go over there and check it out. So her story just gets more incredible. Upon her return from Russia, she moved to New York City, and almost immediately she was discovered by Hollywood and moved out to California to star in films. She had never really been interested in Hollywood, but she decided to give it a try. All this happened when she was in her early 20s, and this all happened so fast. So this is kind of another parallel to Kurt. She had her theater scene, which she thought was more real and credible, and Kurt had his Seattle music scene, which he felt a similar way about. And then suddenly, almost overnight, they're both huge stars making tons of money. Back in the 1930s, when Frances was at the movie studio, it was pretty common for the studios to sculpt the star's image and even rewrite their past. An example of that is that contest she won for selling magazine subscriptions was changed in her official press bio, was changed to a popularity contest that she won. So there was the real Frances, there was the studio version of Frances, and there was the gossip column version of Frances. And reading about Kurt, sometimes it kind of feels similar the way he's presented to us. It's kind of hard to know what's fact and what's fiction. Both of them felt their lives were being made too public. So in an article where he was actually talking about Frances Farmer, I found this really interesting quote from him. And this is the interviewer. Many journalists would say that since Cobain's made his living out of the public, he's become public property. Kurt, you've probably heard this many times before. And then he says, no, I've never heard it put that way. And the interviewer, do you understand that point of view? Absolutely not. I draw the line at the record store or the gig. People can like our record or hate it, throw it away or trade it in for something else, and that's where it ends. But when you were younger, though, and really into music, you must have had posters on your wall. I had posters on my wall, mostly to show off that I was really into music. But weren't there also pop stars that you were really curious about? Absolutely not. What, never? I'm not lying about this. I had absolutely no desire to find out what kind of person any of these rock stars were. I don't think I ever read through a whole article in Cream magazine after I got my first subscription when I was 12. I never finished one because I just didn't care. I just liked the music. The interviewer. You must be fairly unique then, because what are known euphemistically as human interest stories sell enormous quantities of newspapers and magazines. Editors and journalists respond to public demand, and the public, or the record-buying public at any rate, are demanding that your privacy be invaded. That is just a horrible way to put it to him. Like, this person is trying to stir things up. He could have said that differently. Anyways, Kurt says, but what is that? And he's outraged. Who made that rule? And it is a rule, and it means it's gonna go on forever. I'm baffled by it. I'm not interested in that shit. And the interviewer, but you were interested in the life of Frances Farmer and her personal life. That's true. I don't know how I'm gonna get myself out of this. And then he pauses to think, and then he says, I'm not obsessed with her as an artist. That's not what drew me to it. It's a tragic story, and hopefully in telling that story to other people, I can make them see that it's a reality, that it can happen to anybody. I don't know. I just think there should be stricter libel laws. I'm not opposed to investigation, people coming up with proof and facts. If I have done something, then it's fine for people to say so, but I'm a musician. I think politicians and their personal lives should be scrutinized every step of the way, but politicians aren't musicians. Politicians have a huge responsibility. And you don't think you have a huge responsibility? I have a responsibility to not promote a negative lifestyle. If I choose to live my life in a negative way which may influence kids to do what I do, then I have no problem telling kids how lame it is to act that way. I never went out of my way to say anything about my drug use. I tried to hide it as long as I could. The main reason was that I didn't want some 15-year-old kid who likes our band to think it's cool to do heroin, you know? I think people who glamorize drugs are assholes, and if there's a hell, they'll go there. It's really bad karma. I was 15 years old when he gave that interview, so that's kind of cool. So I'm trying to stay to the facts and the proof. for Kurt, but if it's just a theory or an idea, I'll say that and not present it as if it's actual fact. I found it interesting that he said he's not obsessed with her as an artist, which I guess makes sense because it's two different. Acting is really different from music. But maybe he was just interested in her as a person and the way she handled things. But I'm not really sure what he meant. I kind of wish I could ask him. Because he was definitely extremely interested in her. In one of these interviews, he said he read 3 books about her. And he read Shadowland at least twice, if not more. He actually read it for the first time when he was still a kid in Aberdeen. And he wrote to the author of the book. I have a quote about this. So this is from the Rough Guide to Nirvana. Cobain was moved by Farmer's story and even wrote to Arnold after reading his book while still in Aberdeen. And then Arnold says like so many people were writing him about the book that he was just getting hundreds of letters and he didn't have time to answer them, and that's why he never wrote back to Kurt. In an interview, Kurt also compared Courtney to Frances, which I can kind of see, but I think Kurt had a lot more in common with Frances than Courtney did. Courtney could especially relate to Frances Farmer. I made the comparison between the two. When I was reading the book, I realized that could very well happen to Courtney if things kept going on. There's only so much a person can take, you know? I've been told by doctors and psychiatrists that public humiliation is one of the most extreme and hardest things to heal yourself from. It's as bad as being brutally raped or witnessing one of your parents murdered in front of your eyes or something like that. It just goes on and on. It grinds into you and it's so personal. I just simply wanted to remind people of tragedies like that. It's very real and it can happen. People can be driven insane. So according to William Arnold, who wrote the book Shadowland, Kurt was seeing all kinds of parallels between himself and Frances. But it would have been the Frances that's portrayed in this book. So that's who we're talking about, Frances as she's in this book. And the woman in this book was a strong person who had her own thoughts and didn't change them just to please other people. She knew her mind and wasn't afraid to explore ideas. Money wasn't the #1 drive for her. And she was more interested in her art and creativity than the money she could make from it. She was a true individual and a questioner of authority. She's repeatedly described as being shy, quiet, and liking to spend time on her own. And she liked to read and focus on her writing and poetry. She described herself as a very private person. And actually, in one of these articles I came across, that's exactly the words Kurt used to describe himself, that he was a very private person. She didn't care about the Hollywood scene, celebrities, or gossip. She was not a superficial person. I can disagree with some of her views, but I 100% love the person in this book. I think she's great and really admirable. So description about her from the book, which I found really good, was this one by Hollywood correspondent Kyle Crichton. She is a tall, thin girl who is more intelligent looking than beautiful, she's gorgeous, uses no makeup off the set, doesn't give a damn for clothes, is going to be an actress if Hollywood will let her, and is going back this summer to play in the stock company in Seattle. And don't let anybody get the notion she won't do it. Her taste in clothes is atrocious because there is nothing in the world she cares less about. She likes sailing, is not particularly athletic, thinks movie gossip is blah, and will give up all salary boosts ever heard of if they'll give her decent pictures to play in. She is married to Leif Erikson, the movie actor, and they live in a canyon home which will never be photographed as a showplace and can be reached only by mountain guide equipped with a divining rod. The secondhand roadster is getting feebler and faintly less green by the year, and she was cursed soundly by a few hundred motorists on Melrose Ave no later than last February when the engine died and she was out pushing the thing to safety. She sounds like a really down-to-earth person that wasn't letting fame and success change who she was and who she wanted to be. And it's interesting they mention that part about her having not the greatest car, because there's a pretty well-known story about how Kurt returned the Lexus that Courtney bought. So this is from a 2011 Huffington Post article, which actually doesn't really have anything to do with Kurt Cobain. It's about feeling guilty for buying nicer things, I guess, is the idea. There's a famous scenario involving Kurt Cobain, Courtney Love, and a Lexus automobile that I was first exposed to in Chuck Klosterman's essay, Oh, the Guilt. And I'm shamelessly reiterating now, and I guess I'm shamelessly reiterating in a reiteration. Basically, after the success of Nevermind, Cobain flipped out over Love's having bought a Lexus to replace the crappy ancient Volvo the couple had started driving around back when the band's anti-corporate, anti-success punk ethos was actually still believable. The idea was that even though he had the money to buy a Lexus, and if he wanted, to coat the Lexus in liquid platinum and imbue it with perfumated essence of 100 distilled unicorn rainbow farts, he didn't want to be that kind of person who bought a Lexus. So he made her take it back. This seems sort of cool and humble and legit until you think about it, because there's what's more ridiculous, having enough wealth to embrace unironic and self-indulgent luxury, or having the exact same amount of wealth and pretending like you don't anyways. As Klosterman points out, it's not like anybody who pulled up next to Kurt Cobain at a red light would have immediately realized that Cobain had no reason to be driving that obscene Volvo except to look like the kind of person who cares that you'd recognize he's driving that obscene Volvo, which now makes him look like an asshole, especially when you think about the fact that Lexus is a thriving luxury automobile brand because real people, when they can afford to buy Lexuses, actually go out and buy Lexuses. Well, why do they go out and buy Lexuses? As a journalist friend tells Klosterman in the essay, a rich person who self-identifies as being poor is certainly more hypocritical than a rich person whose wife drives a Lexus. Yeah, so you can see he, even in 2011, they're still spinning the stories. You know, maybe he just didn't want a Lexus. Maybe that's just not who he was. Like, he just felt no connection to a Lexus. The man in the article basically is saying it's a symbol of wealth. Well, maybe he doesn't want any part of that symbol. There are people in this world that just truly want nothing more than a simple life. Why complicate things? Why spend money to just spend money? Maybe he had other plans for that money than a useless status symbol car. And maybe he felt if he just put one foot in that direction of becoming that kind of person, he'd lose himself. Why, you know, just he wanted to be true to himself maybe. But you or I or that author can spin it any way we want, because unfortunately Kurt's not here to explain it. But the press wasn't always so harsh to Frances. So when she was young, she went from being hated in her hometown newspaper and by the kids in school and the people she passed on the street to being applauded in the very same newspaper for her newfound Hollywood career. And I think Kurt could probably relate to that because he went from being bullied in school to being adored by those exact same people. People that would never have listened to his music before or even the type of music he liked were suddenly buying his records back in his hometown. He was suddenly a popular person for the first time. So as Frances went on in Hollywood, she began to say that she wanted to leave Hollywood acting. She was more interested in getting back to the theater or possibly exploring her poetry and writing. She just wanted to get out of Hollywood sometimes. And these thoughts began to get her labeled as insane for wanting to give up a Hollywood career. Kurt, too, was known to say that he wanted to quit the band, possibly go solo, or try painting, or just find some other creative outlet. And this got him labeled as having something wrong with him for this desire. So I'm going to read to you just a little bit from this one article, which was written while he was still alive, and he could have possibly even read this article himself. So they were just talking about the Vanity Fair article, which really upset Kurt. Even before that article, Cobain had withdrawn, turning down tour offers so lucrative that inactivity prompted additional speculation about serious personal problems, including a possible nervous breakdown. And that was in 1993. And the key word in that is speculation. It's not proven that he was going to have a nervous breakdown, but he's being portrayed as about to have a nervous breakdown. Which, if you remember earlier, he said Frances Farmer was driven to be insane by what was being written about her. Was that the answer to why he was not wanting to tour? Did he have his own rational reason for it. They didn't ask him. Another really interesting parallel between Kurt and Frances is how quickly they both got married, and the romance leading up to it is very similar. So this is Frances's story. Immediately after filming of the first movie, Frances made a decision that in retrospect was totally out of character with the rest of her life. Whether it was a sudden infatuation or merely because she was lonely and insecure, no one knew. But within the space of a week, she somehow convinced herself she had fallen seriously in love. The man was a fellow Paramount contract student named Wycliffe Anderson, who later was renamed Leif Erikson. Erikson had fallen in love with Frances practically on the spot, as indeed who hadn't. He pursued her relentlessly and finally convinced her that they had everything in common. They rehearsed together, dined in out-of-the-way bistros, took midnight automobile rides up the coast, listened to classical music, spent hours analyzing stories and characters from class. One day in February of 1936, after she had been in Hollywood for less than 5 months, they got in a car, drove to Yuma, Arizona, and were married by a justice of the peace. So that's really similar to Kurt and Courtney. They got married right after he became famous as well. And it was a quick romance, and she was the one that chased after him and convinced him that he should be with her. Another little bit of trivia, which ties in with all of that, is Courtney's dress actually belonged to Frances Farmer. So interesting. Frances had a very kind of funny, sarcastic personality. Unfortunately, she didn't know the right time to say things, and this got her into a lot of trouble. So one night, she was pulled over for drunk driving, and she was very sarcastic to the officer and sped off. And then that led to a warrant being put out for her. And when they went to arrest her, there was quite a scene, and she was just talking back to everyone and saying, it was really funny, the things she was saying, but it got her declared insane and having her rights stripped and sent to an asylum. And some would say that she was railroaded into this because the movie studios were not happy with her behavior and they were losing money. And her mother was not happy with her behavior and her choices and wanted the money that Frances would have made from her movie career. Which brings me to some very strange parallels between events in both of their lives. It was really spooky reading this. Frances was feeling at this point like no one was on her side and no one was understanding her point of view, and she was thrown into an asylum. Kurt was feeling like no one understood him or was on his side, and he was pretty much talked into going off to rehab. Frances was ambushed by her own mother and sent off to the hospital, and it's really sad. I'm going to read you this excerpt from each of these books, and you will just see how these events just really parallel each other. It is not clear whether Mrs. Farmer went to the authorities or the authorities came to her, but she had several mysterious meetings with various city officials that March and somehow became convinced that it was necessary to swear out a public complaint against her daughter. On the morning of March 21st, 1944, Frances came down to breakfast as usual. Mrs. Farmer was standing nervously in the foyer, staring out the window when Frances sat down at the breakfast table. Her mother suddenly appeared excited. "Hurry and finish your juice," she said. "The boys are here." "What boys?" Frances looked up just in time to see 3 attendants come rushing through the back door. They grabbed her as she sat at the table, bloodied her face, wrestled her into a straitjacket, and dragged her kicking and screaming to the psychiatric ward of Seattle's public Harborview Hospital. That's horrible. You're in your home, you're in your childhood home with your mother, and she just has you dragged off. That's terrible. She thought she was going to be able to have a rest at home, and that's what happens. Which is kind of similar to what Kurt thought was, he'd come home from Rome, he thought he was going to rest up, and then the intervention happens, and he feels ambushed. This intervention did surprise Kurt, though the timing ultimately was unfortunate. Kurt and Dylan had just gotten high. Me and Kurt had been up all night partying, Dylan explained. And both me and him had just woken up and done a wake-up shot and walked downstairs, and this sea of people were there to confront him. Kurt was furious, showing the anger of a newly caged beast. His first reaction was to grab a recycling bin and throw it at Dylan, who he thought had lured him. Dylan told Kurt he wasn't in on it and urged Kurt to leave, but Kurt stayed and faced a room full of his manager's friends and bandmates. It was as if he were on trial, and like a remorseful criminal in a capital case, he kept his eyes focused on the floor during the entire proceedings. In the room were Courtney, Danny Goldberg, John Silva, Janet Billig from Gold Mountain, Mark Cates, Gary Gersh from his label, Pat Smear from the band, Callie the nanny, and the counselor David Burr. So pretty much just people that were interested in him because of his money. That's terrible. It's ambushed. And I don't know how they would think that was a good idea. Obviously he must have talked to those people about Frances Farmer. They must have known it would have made him feel the same way. But then I came across even spookier, kind of a parallel. The complaint said that Mrs. Farmer stated that Frances had rejected her profession and means of livelihood, had frequently run off to be alone, and had been driven into a dangerously hysterical condition by various traumatic experiences of the past few years. She further stated Frances made some progress at home and showed no evidence of violence until the last 3 weeks. On March 12th, she turned the radio on loudly, which I knew would annoy the neighbors. I asked her to turn it down, and she became quite angry, grabbed my wrists, and pushed me into a chair. My arms became black and blue. I realized at once that she needed institutional care, as I am entirely unable to control her at home. It seems extraordinary, but under the law, the accusation of insanity was all that was necessary for Frances to be considered an insane person and therefore subject to arrest. So when I was reading these articles where Kurt was talking about Frances Farmer, there was one where Chris actually tells a story about Kurt and Courtney, which is so similar to that. It was just spooky. Okay, so this is Chris talking. And this was when the cops had been called, and I think it was July 1993, from a complaint. They'd been called from a noise complaint. That was a fucking bunch of bullshit. They were cranking music in their house, and a neighbor called the cops, and I think they got into a fight. There's this law in Washington, and I went through it with my parents, that's called the domestic violence law. It says that if the cops show up and somebody has to go to jail, whether anything happened or not, that's the law. The cops couldn't have any discretion, and Kurt had to go to jail. So there's music being played too loud, and he gets in a fight with Courtney, and the cops come, and because the cops come, he has to go to jail. It's so much like that incident with Frances and her mother. Is spooky. And so that brings us to my final very strange parallel. At first, she welcomed the apparent peacefulness of the place and the reduced pace of her life. She was given a cheerful enough room, the nurses seemed considerate and sympathetic, she played ping-pong and caught up on her reading, and took long contemplative strolls around the grassy hospital grounds. She seems fully recovered and is now the same Frances Farmer you knew when she first came to Hollywood, one psychiatrist there told a reporter. After several months of this forced creative inactivity, however, she became restless and depressed. She got into arguments with the nurses. She didn't want to see visitors. Most of all, she wanted out of there and back into some constructive form of work. So I read that, and I just got the weirdest, strangest feeling that the next thing that was going to happen would be that she jumped over the back wall of the hospital. And I go down, and I'm like, that's silly. That's not going to happen. And I turn the page, and I read this. When she tried to read, she was unable to concentrate on the lines. When she tried to write poetry, it no longer came. She had gone to the sanitarium voluntarily, she said, because she realized she needed a rest, but the sanitarium was systematically destroying the only thing she had ever been able to hold on to in her life, her faith in her artistic creativity. The records report that Frances became so upset over insulin injections that she tried to escape. One day in the early fall of 1943, she was strolling through the sanitarium grounds, as she was permitted to do each day before lunch. While the guard was looking the other way, she ran to the back wall and made a dash for it. Before they caught up with her, she hitchhiked to her half-sister Rita's house in Venice and called her mother. So that's exactly what she did. She jumped over the back wall of the hospital. That was so strange to me because I was thinking of Kurt when I read that other page, and I just knew that that was what Frances was going to do. It was really strange. So you might not know what I'm talking about, and I'll read you about Kurt jumping the wall of the rehab. In the early afternoon, Kurt sat in the smoking area behind Exodus, chatting with Gibby. Most repeat rehab patients, which both Kurt and Gibby were, approached treatment with gallows humor, and the two of them gossiped about others with the problems worse than their own. One drummer had developed such severe abscesses that his arm had been amputated. Gibby joked he was glad he was just the singer, and Kurt had to laugh at this. They chuckled over a mutual acquaintance who had escaped Exodus by jumping over the back wall. This was completely unnecessary since the front doors were unlocked. Me and Kurt were laughing about what a dumbass he was for escaping over the wall, Haynes recalled. That afternoon, Kurt was visited by Pat Smear and Joe Mama Nitzberg. Mama was an artist friend of Courtney's who had been through drug treatment before himself. The previous year, in an act of altruism never publicized, Kurt paid for Mama's art school tuition when Mama's financial aid was denied. Courtney had sent Mama to Exodus with a letter for Kurt along with some candy and a fanzine she thought he'd like. Mama was surprised at how lucid Kurt was with just a day of sobriety. "You look good. How do you feel?" he asked. "I don't feel that bad," was Kurt's deadpan response. The three of them went to the back patio so Kurt could smoke. Gibby was still out there and making the same jokes about jumping the wall. They chatted for almost an hour, but it was mostly small talk. Kurt had always wanted to go to art school and told Mama he was envious. Okay, and then at 7:43 that evening, Michael Miesel's roommate answered the phone. It was Kurt. "Michael's out for the evening," the roommate announced. "Should I have him call you?" Kurt said he wasn't going to be near the phone. 2 minutes later, he walked out the back door of Exodus and climbed the 6-foot wall he and Gibby had joked about earlier in the day. He had departed Exodus with only the clothes on his back. In his room, he left a couple of shirts and a recently started journal containing 4 embryonic songs. So it's not exactly the same scenario, but there is echoes of Frances in Kurt's story. Hey, so I'm back. I had to re-edit the video just a tiny bit because I found this strange article and it kind of changed my ideas on a few things. I was talking about, to put it in William Arnold's words, how Kurt kind of embodied the spirit of Frances Farmer. But then I came across, completely by accident, I wasn't even looking for it, it was just kind of open on my computer, actually. I don't even really know how the article was there, but the article was there on my computer, and it had a really more detailed information from William Arnold about the sort of phone calls he was receiving from Kurt that kind of just, I don't even know what to think. So I'm going to start with what I was originally saying because it leads up to this second article. So I'll be back after the first article to read you the second article. According to that Rough Guide to Nirvana by Gillian Garr, he was very, very much thinking about Frances that last month or so of his life. And this is from that book. Cobain turns the victim into the victor, envisioning the actress finally vanquishing her foes. Cobain tried to contact Arnold again. So you remember when he was much younger, when he first read the book, he wrote to Arnold, who wrote Shadowland, but he never got a reply. He was leaving messages on his voicemail at work. Arnold, who hadn't been following the local music scene, had no idea who the persistent caller was until the Post-Intelligencer's arts and entertainment editor told him, explaining that Cobain had also contacted her, asking Arnold to call him. Arnold then received further voicemail messages from Cobain, which he recalls as rambling, describing the impact Arnold's book had on him and the speculation that I might be related to Judge John Frater, who had signed the first order to commit Francis. After returning from a trip, Arnold had plans to contact Cobain. On the top of his to-do list for 8th of April, 1994, was a notation, return the call to KC, the Nirvana guy. Instead, Arnold wound up writing an article entitled, Cobain Found a Kindred Spirit in Francis Farmer's Tragic Life, for the April 14th edition of the paper, saying of Cobain, from his punkish honesty meant to shock to his outbursts of violence, Cobain's behavior might be interpreted as the actions of a man determined to embody the spirit of Francis Farmer. So it's really interesting that the author of the book perceived Kurt as somebody who wanted to embody the spirit of Francis Farmer. I think he has some wrong. I don't know what he's talking about, outbursts of violence. I don't know where he was getting that from. But that's really interesting, and I would love to read that article. I couldn't find it. I tried to find it. I couldn't find it. If anyone has it, I'd like to read it. Hey, I'm back with that strange story I found, magazine story I found. So originally, I was going to go off in a direction, which is to quote William Arnold, that Kurt Cobain sort of embodied the spirit of Francis Farmer. But I'm going to drop that idea for this video and just tell you some really weird things. So this I found completely by accident. I wasn't looking for this article. I wasn't looking for any of this information. I just accidentally happened upon it. And this was an article basically about Francis Farmer, but the author of it worked with William Arnold and kind of briefly interviewed him. And this is what William Arnold had to say. William Arnold was the paper's gifted staff film critic, a spry man in his early 60s. One day I asked him to review a new Kurt Cobain documentary about a son. He uncharacteristically refused. I have a personal connection to Kurt Cobain, he emailed, and I would feel a conflict. Later in person, he was cryptic at first. Well, you know about Kurt. How he was obsessed with Francis Farmer. Yes, I told him. I'm obsessed with her too. Well, I wrote a book about Francis. You wrote a book on Francis? I exclaimed. Okay, I get it. We'll hire a freelancer. I pressed him for more details. Kurt had read my book, Shadowland, and he called me all the time, wanting to meet with me. He left messages, saying things like, I want to sit down and talk to you about this. I think they are doing the same thing to me that they did to Francis, or words to that effect. But by the time I had heard that kind of message so many times, I didn't call him back. After his suicide, I got a call from a guy who said he was Kurt's psychiatrist in California. And he went on and on about Kurt's fixation and how he was afraid he was going to be lobotomized, and this is why he killed himself. I suppose it could have been a crank, but it really freaked me out. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. That just left me with a lot of questions. So I was trying to figure out when Kurt would have been calling William Arnold. So previously, so the only mentions of Kurt calling William Arnold I could find were this article, that mention in the Nirvana Rough Guide, which I had read before, and another book by the same author of the Nirvana Rough Guide. And this is what it says. Cobain had been fascinated by Farmer's story since reading Arnold's book in high school. And after he himself became a star, he identified even more with her story, especially with Farmer's unconventional nature, her outspoken dislike of commercialism, her hounding by the media, and her sad, unjust fate. Arnold worked as a film critic at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, a daily newspaper, and Cobain made several attempts to contact him in 1993. When he didn't respond, Cobain contacted the arts and entertainment editor at the paper, who passed the message on to Arnold. I said, "Who's Kurt Cobain?" he recalls. She was shocked that I didn't know who he was. So it just goes on with more of the same information, but that one said 1993. But I'm wondering when, like how close it was to his death. Was it the end of 1993? Was he still calling in 1994? Because why would William Arnold if it had months had gone by, why would he bother even calling him back at that point if he hadn't heard anything from him anymore? But I'm just trying to figure out when Kurt was calling William Arnold back in the end of July. He didn't think it was himself that something like that could happen to. He thought it was Courtney, which I find kind of strange because Courtney wanted fame and Courtney wanted money, so I don't know why people would do that to her. But this is what Kurt had to say. Interviewer: most of your songs are, in one way or another, about suffering. A popular liberal notion is that suffering ennobles. Do you think there's any truth to that? Kurt: It can. I think a small amount of suffering is healthy. It makes your character stronger. Do you think you've suffered on a large or small scale? What do you think I think? Don't know. I've suffered on a large scale, but most of the attacks haven't been on me. They've been on someone I'm totally in love with. My best fucking friend is being completely fucking crucified every 2 months, if not more. I read a negative article about her every 2 months. Why read it? Why torture yourself? A lot of the time, I can't escape it because Courtney gets faxes of articles from the publicists all the time. But also, it's a form of protection. It enables you to remember who has fucked with you and make sure you never deal with those people again. And another reason we like to read it is that we can learn from the criticism, too. If I never read any of those interviews that I did, I'd never be able to say, geez, that was a really stupid thing to say. I better try and clear it up. Kurt describes Courtney as media literate. She isn't. Often, she's media hungry. More often, overly image conscious. An hour ago in the hotel foyer, she approached us and unsolicited, offered us tales of drug smuggling, and when it came to that book, that bloody book, bitter refutations of things we had no idea she'd been accused of. And she was trying to stop the publication of a book about her at the time, and I think she succeeded. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of think it must have been late in 93, like the very end of 93, but I don't know. I'm just really curious about that. I've never heard anything about that before, about him feeling like he was going to be put into a Frances Farmer situation. And what a Frances Farmer situation is like a kind of a Britney Spears type of a situation. And things like that obviously do still happen. But I don't even think that was a real psychiatrist calling William Arnold, because I don't think a psychiatrist would just call up someone and start talking about their patient. And what would the point of that be if their patient is already dead? That's not going to help him in any way to call William Arnold. So there'd be no reason for the psychiatrist to call William Arnold and explain all this stuff to him. That seems weird. Another thought I had was that maybe that wasn't even really Kurt calling William Arnold. I don't know why someone would impersonate him and call him, but you never know. It's just very weird. But if Kurt did feel like that, that would make sense that William Arnold would be the one person that he would feel like he could trust, because William Arnold wrote a book about someone that had happened to, and might know some way that he could help Kurt if Kurt really thought that was happening to him. So that's really sad to me that William Arnold didn't ever get back to him. Another reason I don't think that was Kurt's real psychiatrist was I don't think he even had an actual psychiatrist. This book says he was trying to talk to several different ones on the phone, but it wasn't really working out. And then at the intervention, it says, he frantically grabbed the yellow pages and turned to the section for psychiatrists. I don't trust anybody here, he declared. I'm going to get a psychiatrist out of the yellow pages I can trust. Which I thought was kind of weird when I read that, because it's a drug intervention and they want him to go to rehab. They weren't trying to get him psychiatric help. They were trying to get him into rehab. So I didn't understand why he was saying that about a psychiatrist, but if he was being made to feel like he was going to be in a Frances Farmer type of a situation, that would make sense that he would say, I don't trust anybody here, I want to find my own psychiatrist. So I hadn't heard anything about this before, as I said, so I ended up reading several books, looking for information, like reading the whole entire books. I went a little crazy. And that was when I found this even stranger bit of information. So this is from a book by Courtney's father, and to be honest, I don't really think this book is that accurate at all. But this one particular thing I could see being accurate because it's just describing when she was younger, when she was a teenager and living with her father. And it's just really random and it's not really connected to anything. It's just like a memory he has of her. So I don't know why he would put this in here, even to be honest. And there's no reason to make this up because it's not connected to anything. But it's about Frances Farmer, so it was really strange. She watched, and it's talking about Courtney. She watched the Frances Farmer story at my house obsessively. And the Frances Farmer story he's talking about, that's the movie that the book Shadowland is based on. So she watched the Frances Farmer story at my house obsessively, long before she met Cobain, and made me buy the tape to have on file when she came around to visit. That and Eraserhead, Pretty in Pink, Rocky Horror Show, and a few other teenage angst movies. From 1984 onward, 5 years before she claims she first met Cobain, Courtney was obsessed with Frances Farmer. How do I know? She wrote about the Frances Farmer story when she lived with us in 1983. She watched it over and over again and took copious notes, saying she was writing a song for her band, Sugar Babylon. She asked me if a lobotomy could really work. Obviously, she identified with the martyrdom of the ill-fated movie star. Yeah, I don't know. That's just really weird. Very, very bizarre. I don't know. Okay, and now back to the rest of the video I had previously recorded. One last kind of strange coincidence I'll tell you is that while I was researching articles for this video, I saw that the hospital, the rehab facility that Kurt stayed at, is often referred to as the Freeman Marina Exodus Rehab, which is interesting because the doctor who the author of this book makes a big deal out of the name of is Dr. Freeman, and Dr. Freeman is the one he claims gave Frances her lobotomy. So that would be kind of spooky if you were really obsessed with Frances Farmer and discovered you were at the Freeman Rehab Facility. So I'm going to wrap this up with a quote from Kurt and then a quote from William Arnold. It's about becoming too involved in the lives of famous people. Do you really think that a kid could be so impressed by a star's negative lifestyle that they'd take it up themselves? And then Kurt, oh, they do. Absolutely. I saw this movie, Over the Edge, and he loves that movie. He's always talking about it. It's a good movie. I remember leaving the theater and almost everyone who was in there came running out, screaming their heads off and breaking windows and vandalizing and wanting to get high. It totally affected them and it influenced them. It may not have been the intention of the person who made that movie, and it is a great movie, but that's what happened. It happens a lot with movies and music, and the people who are affected by it are usually not very evolved people in the first place. So William Arnold tries to say that Kurt is that sort of person, and I don't think Frances Farmer affected him in that sense. But I don't know. It's all very strange. So William Arnold, the author of Shadowland, has to say, Cobain's identification with Farmer also made Arnold think hard about how a writer's work can influence people in ways the writer can't foresee, but that shouldn't be dismissed. I feel like when you write something and it influences people, that gives you a certain kind of moral responsibility. You can't just ignore that, he says. He ends his article on a cautionary note for Cobain's fans. It is a big mistake to judge your own life by the life of someone else, particularly a celebrity. Even the most appealing, soothing, and seemingly positive of myths can be, if embraced too fervently, enormously destructive. Okay, that's it. I hope maybe you found it a little interesting. And if you made it to the end of this video, you're amazing. Thanks for watching. Maybe I'll see you next time.